The blade sliced through 3 months of painstaking work in a single, vicious stroke. Paint and canvas fragments scattered across the art room floor as Maya Chen watched her masterpiece, a tribute to her late grandmother, disintegrate before her eyes. But what happened next left 3-star football players crawling on their hands and knees, begging for mercy from a woman they'd dismissed as just another fragile art teacher. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maya Chen had always been an easy target. Standing barely 5 feet tall with delicate features that made her look younger than her 28 years, she possessed the kind of gentle demeanor that drew predators like moths to flame. Her black hair was perpetually dusted with paint, her clothes a canvas of colorful accidents, and her voice rarely rose above a whisper even when addressing her largest classes. Students at Riverside High had grown accustomed to her soft-spoken nature, her patient corrections, and her seemingly endless tolerance for disruption. What they didn't know was that the same hands that created breathtaking landscapes had once shattered concrete blocks. The same feet that shuffled quietly through hallways had once delivered kicks powerful enough to crack ribs. Maya Chen wasn't just an art teacher who dabbed in martial arts as a hobby. She was a third-degree black belt in Kyokushin karate who had spent 15 years competing at national levels before hanging up her fighting gloves to pursue her true passion, nurturing young artistic minds. The transition from dojo to classroom hadn't been easy. Maya had grown up in a household where weakness invited punishment, where her father's military discipline meant that showing emotion was tantamount to surrender. Karate had been her escape, her way of channeling the rage and pain into something constructive. The discipline, the focus, the absolute control over mind and body, these had become as natural to her as breathing. But teaching had called to her heart in a way that competition never could. She wanted to create beauty, not destroy it. She wanted to heal, not harm. For 3 years at Riverside High, Maya had successfully maintained her peaceful facade. She'd endured snide comments about her ethnicity, weathered jokes about her height, and absorbed countless small cruelties with the same stoic grace her martial arts training had instilled. The administration appreciated her lack of complaints, the parents loved her dedication to their children's creativity, and most students respected her genuine passion for art. She seemed to have found the tranquil life she'd been seeking. Then came the autumn semester that would change everything. Brandon Mitchell arrived at Riverside High with the kind of swagger that only comes from a lifetime of getting everything handed to you. At 18, he stood 6'4" with the broad shoulders and thick neck of someone who'd been bench pressing since middle school. His father owned the largest construction company in 3 counties. His mother sat on the school board, and his older brother had been the town's golden boy before heading off to play college football on a full scholarship. Brandon wasn't just continuing a legacy. He was living up to impossible expectations with the kind of reckless abandon that comes from knowing consequences never quite stick. The quarterback position had been his birthright, claimed before he'd even thrown his first pass in practice. His arm was adequate, his field vision mediocre, but his intimidation factor was unmatched. Teammates who might have challenged his leadership found themselves reconsidering after witnessing what happened to those who crossed him. Teachers who might have held him accountable for missed assignments or poor behavior discovered that their concerns mysteriously evaporated when they received calls from influential parents or found their class funding mysteriously cut. Brandon's inner circle consisted of 2 equally privileged lieutenants who'd learned that proximity to power was better than possessing it themselves. Derek Santos, the team's starting tight end, had inherited his position through sheer size rather than skill. At 6'2" and 230 pounds, he was more battering ram than athlete, but his willingness to hurt people made him valuable both on and off the field. His family had moved to town 5 years earlier when his father bought out a struggling auto dealership, and Derek had quickly learned that blending in with the established hierarchy was easier than fighting it. The third member of their trinity was Alex Winters, whose lean frame and quick wit made him the perfect complement to his friend's brute force approach. Alex was the strategist, the one who planned their campaigns of terror with the kind of methodical precision that would have impressed military tacticians. His father was the town's most successful attorney, and Alex had absorbed enough legal knowledge to know exactly how far they could push before crossing lines that might actually matter. He was the one who identified targets, mapped out weaknesses, and ensured that their activities always had plausible deniability. Together, they formed a triumvirate of teenage tyranny that had gone unchallenged for too long. Their reign of terror wasn't the crude, obvious bullying of earlier generations. This was sophisticated psychological warfare designed to break spirits without leaving physical evidence. They specialized in destroying the things their victims cared about most. Academic projects the night before they were due, musical instruments that mysteriously suffered accidents, sports equipment that vanished before crucial games. Maya had managed to avoid their attention for most of the semester through the simple expedient of being invisible. She arrived early, stayed late, and kept her head down during the brief periods when their paths might cross. Her art room was tucked away in the oldest wing of the building, far from the main traffic patterns where predators typically hunted. She'd cultivated relationships with the kind of students who also preferred the shadows. The quiet ones, the different ones, the ones who found solace in creativity rather than social dominance. But invisibility only works if you never shine too brightly, and Maya's latest project was about to make her impossible to ignore. The memorial piece had begun as a personal healing exercise. Maya's grandmother, the woman who had first put a paintbrush in her tiny hands, had passed away the previous spring after a long battle with Alzheimer's. The disease had stolen her memories piece by piece, but somehow she'd always remembered teaching Maya to paint watercolor flowers in the small garden behind their house. Those moments, captured in Maya's childhood memory like precious photographs, had become the inspiration for what would become her masterpiece. The canvas was massive, 4 feet by 6 feet of pure creative ambition. Maya had been working on it for 3 months, staying after school until the janitors politely reminded her that they needed to lock up. Every flower petal was rendered with photographic precision. Every dewdrop caught the light as if it were real moisture rather than carefully layered paint. The background was a subtle wash of greens and browns that seemed to pulse with life, while the foreground exploded with the kind of vibrant colors that made viewers feel like they could smell the garden's perfume. But it wasn't just technically impressive, it was emotionally devastating. Anyone who looked at it could feel the love Maya had poured into every brushstroke, the grief transformed into something beautiful, the memory made eternal through art. Students had begun stopping by her classroom just to stare at it, many leaving with tears in their eyes. Word had spread through the school like wildfire, and even teachers from other departments were finding excuses to visit Maya's room. The attention was everything Maya had spent years trying to avoid. She'd grown uncomfortable with the praise, the requests for interviews from the local newspaper, the suggestions that she submit the piece to state art competitions. All she'd wanted was to honor her grandmother's memory and work through her own grief. She'd never intended to become the center of attention, never wanted to shine a spotlight on herself. Unfortunately, that spotlight made her impossible for Brandon and his crew to ignore. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday afternoon when Maya discovered that someone had rearranged her art supplies. Nothing was missing, nothing was broken, but every tube of paint had been opened and squeezed slightly, just enough to let air in and begin the drying process that would eventually ruin them. It was subtle, almost certainly unnoticeable to anyone who wasn't intimately familiar with the organization of the room, but Maya knew immediately that someone had been in her space. The next day, she found that several of her brushes had been soaked in turpentine overnight. Again, nothing stolen, nothing obviously vandalized, but tools that had taken her years to collect and cost her considerable money were now useless. She filed a report with the administration, but without evidence of who might have done it, they could only promise to, quote, keep an eye on things, and suggest she might want to lock up her more valuable supplies. By Thursday, Maya was keeping her grandmother's memorial piece covered with a protective cloth whenever she left the room. She'd installed a small security camera in the corner, hoping to catch whoever was systematically sabotaging her workspace. She was sleeping poorly, jumping at every unexpected sound, feeling like prey being stalked by predators she couldn't see. Friday afternoon brought the escalation she'd been dreading. Maya was in the main office, arguing quietly with the principal about getting better locks for her classroom, when she heard the commotion from down the hall. Shouting, laughter, the sound of something heavy hitting the floor, all coming from the direction of her art room. She ran through the corridors, her soft-soled shoes slapping against the polished linoleum, her heart hammering against her ribs with each step. The door to her classroom stood wide open. and she could see figures moving inside. Brandon Mitchell's distinctive laugh echoed off the walls, followed by Derek's deeper guffaws and Alex's more restrained chuckling. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maya slowed her approach, instinctively shifting into the silent, predatory movement she'd learned in years of martial arts training. Something inside her, something she'd spent 3 years carefully suppressing, began to stir. She reached the doorway and stopped, her body going completely still as she processed the scene before her. Brandon stood in front of her easel, a box cutter gleaming in his right hand. Derek was holding her grandmother's memorial piece steady while Alex filmed with his phone. The protective cloth lay crumpled on the floor like a discarded shroud. "This is what happens," Brandon was saying to Alex's camera, his voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that comes from a lifetime of consequence-free actions. "When people think they're better than everyone else, when they think their little hobby makes them special." Maya watched in frozen horror as he raised the box cutter toward her grandmother's painted flowers. 3 months of work, hundreds of hours of careful labor, a memorial to the woman who'd shaped her entire life, all about to be destroyed by a teenage sociopath who'd probably forgotten why he was angry by tomorrow. "Stop," she said quietly from the doorway. All 3 boys turned toward her, and Maya saw something flicker across their faces. Not guilt. They were long past the capacity for that emotion. Not fear. They'd never had reason to experience it. What she saw was surprise that she'd actually spoken up, followed immediately by anticipation. They'd been hoping she'd catch them in the act. The destruction was only half the point. Her reaction was the real prize they were after. "Oh, hey, Miss Chen," Alex said, not bothering to lower his phone. "Don't mind us, we're just having a little art appreciation session." Brandon grinned, the box cutter still poised above the canvas. "Yeah, we were just talking about how this painting is taking up way too much space. Maybe it needs to be resized." "Put the knife down," Maya said, her voice still barely above a whisper but carrying an edge that none of them had heard before. Derek laughed, a sound like rocks tumbling down a mountainside. "Or what? You'll give us detention? Report us to the principal? Face it, lady, nobody cares about your feelings." "My grandmother," Maya said, stepping fully into the room, "painted with me when I was 5 years old. She taught me that art could heal pain, that beauty could survive ugliness, that love could outlast death. That painting is my memory of her." "Ah," Brandon said in mock sympathy, "that's really touching. Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to show off in front of the whole school. Maybe you should have remembered your place." The blade bit into the canvas. Maya felt something snap inside her chest, a sound like a guitar string breaking under too much tension. For 3 years, she'd suppressed every instinct that had been drilled into her through 15 years of martial arts training. She'd swallowed her pride, ignored her anger, and convinced herself that peace was more important than justice. She'd believed that kindness could overcome cruelty, that patience could outlast aggression, that turning the other cheek was always the right choice. She'd been wrong. The box cutter sliced through the top of the canvas, destroying the delicate cherry blossoms she'd spent 2 weeks perfecting. Paint and canvas fragments scattered across the floor as Brandon dragged the blade downward, his grin widening with each inch of destruction. Derek held the frame steady, providing the tension needed to make the cuts clean and devastating. Alex continued filming, capturing every moment of vandalism for whatever social media campaign they had planned. Maya's world narrowed to a single point of focus. Her breathing slowed, her heart rate dropped, and her mind entered the state of absolute clarity that had carried her through countless tournaments. Every detail became crystal clear. The angle of Brandon's grip on the knife, Derek's off-balance stance as he held the frame, Alex's position near the window, with his back partially turned toward her. "That's enough," she said, and this time her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent years learning to break things that fought back. Brandon paused mid-cut, something in her tone finally penetrating his arrogance. He turned toward her with the knife still in his hand, and for the first time, Maya saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I said that's enough," Maya repeated, taking a step forward. "Yeah?" Brandon straightened to his full height, using his size to intimidate the way he always had. "What are you going to do about it? You're what, like 5 feet tall?" I could step on you. Derek released the canvas and moved to Brandon's side, cracking his knuckles in a display that had terrified smaller students for years. Alex kept filming but shifted position to get a better angle, anticipating the humiliation of the tiny art teacher that was surely about to unfold. Maya looked at the three of them standing in her classroom, surrounded by the tools of creation they'd turned into instruments of destruction. She looked at her grandmother's memorial piece, half destroyed and hanging in tatters from the easel. She looked at the box cutter in Brandon's hand, still dripping with flecks of paint like blood from a wound. And then Maya Chen stopped being a teacher and remembered what it felt like to be a weapon. "Last chance," she said, settling into a stance that looked casual but positioned her weight perfectly for explosive movement. "Walk away," Brandon laughed, the sound echoing off the classroom walls. "Lady, you've been watching too many movies. This is real life. In real life, people like you get hurt when they try to stand up to people like us." He raised the box cutter, not in a threatening gesture toward Maya, but to continue his destruction of the painting. It was a calculated insult, a demonstration that he didn't consider her enough of a threat to even acknowledge. He was going to finish destroying her grandmother's memory while she watched helplessly, and then he and his friends would walk away laughing. Maya moved. 15 years of training compressed into a single moment of perfect execution. Her left foot pivoted as her right leg swept forward, covering the distance between them faster than Brandon's eyes could track. Her hand struck his wrist with surgical precision, hitting the exact nerve cluster that would cause his fingers to spasm open. The box cutter went flying, clattering against the far wall and sliding under a cabinet where it could hurt no one. Brandon stared at his empty hand in confusion, his brain struggling to process what had just happened. Derek started forward with a roar of anger, swinging a haymaker that would have flattened most people but met only empty air as Maya flowed around the punch like water around a stone. Her elbow found the soft spot just below Derek's sternum, driving the air from his lungs in a whoosh that left him gasping. As he doubled over, Maya's knee came up to meet his descending face, but she pulled the strike at the last second, letting it tap his forehead just hard enough to send him stumbling backward. Alex dropped his phone, the device skittering across the floor as he fumbled for the classroom door. Maya's hand shot out, gripping his shirt and spinning him around with enough force to send him careening into a desk. He went down hard, papers and art supplies cascading around him like confetti. The entire encounter had lasted less than 10 seconds. 3 athletes who had terrorized Riverside High for months were scattered around Maya's classroom like broken toys, none of them seriously injured but all of them completely neutralized. Maya stood in the center of the chaos, her breathing barely elevated, her small hands steady as she surveyed the scene. Brandon struggled to his feet, his face cycling through confusion, rage, and something that might have been the first genuine fear he'd experienced in his privileged life. You can't. This is assault. I'll have you arrested. My father will. Your father will what?" Maya interrupted, her voice carrying a deadly quiet that made all 3 boys flinch. "Explain to the police why his son was caught on video destroying school property with a weapon? Because that's what happened here, Brandon. You brought a knife into my classroom and used it to vandalize a memorial to my deceased grandmother. Everything else was just me defending myself." She gestured toward Alex's phone, which was still recording from where it had fallen. The camera had captured the entire encounter from the perfect angle to show Brandon's attack on the painting and Maya's measured response to 3 larger opponents. Derek was still wheezing, trying to refill lungs that had been completely emptied by Maya's precisely placed elbow strike. Alex remained on the floor, staring up at the ceiling with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered. Brandon looked between his disabled friends and the tiny woman who had dismantled all of them without breaking a sweat. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Maya picked up Alex's phone and stopped the recording. "Yes," she said simply, "it is. You've terrorized students for months, Brandon. You've destroyed their projects, ruined their confidence, and made their lives miserable because you thought you were untouchable. Today you learned that you're not." She walked to her desk and picked up her own phone, dialing the main office with practiced calm. "Principal Morrison? This is Maya Chen. I need you to come to my classroom immediately. I have 3 students who were caught vandalizing school property with a weapon, and I'll need the police contacted for criminal charges." Brandon's face went white. You can't prove anything. Maya held up Alex's phone, which had captured everything in high definition. Actually, I can prove everything. Your friend was kind enough to film your confession and the entire attack. The district attorney is going to love this. The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway made all three boys look toward the door with growing panic. Principal Morrison's voice could be heard directing security guards and asking someone to contact the police. The consequences that had always managed to slip away from them were finally closing in. Maya looked at the ruins of her grandmother's memorial painting, at the scattered art supplies, at the three young men who had thought they could destroy beauty without facing any consequences. Something fundamental had shifted in her classroom, in the school, and in herself. The gentle teacher who had spent 3 years turning the other cheek was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes peace could only be achieved through strength. The door opened and Principal Morrison entered, followed by 2 security guards and Officer Janet Rodriguez from the school resource unit. They took in the scene with professional eyes, noting the damaged artwork, the scattered supplies, the 3 disheveled students, and the calm teacher standing in the center of it all. Miss Chen, Principal Morrison said carefully, "Can you tell me what happened here?" Maya gestured toward the phone in her hand. "Everything you need to know is right here, sir. These 3 students broke into my classroom, destroyed a memorial painting I'd been working on for 3 months, and threatened me with a box cutter when I tried to stop them. I defended myself using minimal force and called for help immediately." Officer Rodriguez stepped forward, her hand resting casually on her radio. "Anyone require medical attention?" Maya looked at Brandon, Derek, and Alex, all of whom were upright and conscious despite their obvious shock. "I don't believe so. I was very careful not to cause any serious injuries." "Very careful," Derek wheezed, still struggling to breathe normally. "You're lucky she was," Officer Rodriguez said grimly. "Breaking and entering, vandalism, assault with a weapon, intimidation of a school employee. You boys have just graduated from school disciplinary issues to felony charges." Brandon found his voice again, some of his old arrogance returning now that adults were present. "This is ridiculous. She attacked us. Look at us. We're the victims here." Principal Morrison picked up Alex's phone, which was still open to the camera app. "Mr. Winters, am I to understand that you filmed this entire incident?" Alex looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. You were just documenting your crimes," Officer Rodriguez finished for him. "That actually makes my job a lot easier. Miss Chen, I'll need to take your statement, but from what I can see here, this is a pretty clear-cut case of self-defense against multiple armed attackers." Maya nodded calmly, though inside she was still processing what had just happened. For 3 years, she'd convinced herself that she'd left her martial arts life behind, that violence was never the answer, that peace was always possible if you just tried hard enough. Today she'd learned that sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to fight for it. As Officer Rodriguez began reading the 3 boys their rights, and Principal Morrison started making phone calls to parents and district officials, Maya walked over to the remains of her grandmother's painting. The destruction was total. Months of work reduced to ribbons of canvas and smears of paint, but somehow, looking at it now, she didn't feel the crushing grief she'd expected. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction that comes from standing up to bullies and winning. Her grandmother would have understood. The woman who had survived poverty, discrimination, and loss to build a better life for her family would have approved of Maya finally fighting back against those who sought to destroy rather than create. Maya Chen had come to Riverside High to teach art and find peace. Instead, she'd discovered that sometimes the most important lessons can't be taught with words alone. Sometimes you have to show people that kindness backed by strength is the only kind that truly matters. As the 3 former tormentors were led away in handcuffs, Maya began the long process of cleaning up her classroom. Tomorrow, she would start a new painting. This time, she wouldn't hide her light under a bushel. This time, she would paint with the confidence of someone who knew she could protect what she created. The age of fear at Riverside High was coming to an end, and it had ended with a tiny art teacher who remembered how to fight. The police station buzzed with activity as news of the incident spread through the small town like wildfire. Brandon Mitchell sat in the back of Officer Rodriguez's patrol car, his wrists zip-tied behind him, staring through the bulletproof glass at a world that suddenly seemed much less accommodating than it had that morning. The leather seats that had once symbolized authority and protection now felt like a cage, and the familiar downtown streets looked different when viewed from the wrong side of the law. Derek Santos occupied the passenger seat of the second patrol car, still struggling to breathe normally after Maya's precisely placed elbow strike. Every inhale reminded him of the moment when his confidence had evaporated, along with the air in his lungs. The pain wasn't severe, but it was persistent enough to serve as a constant reminder that everything he thought he knew about power dynamics had just been proven wrong. His father's auto dealership sat 3 blocks away, its neon sign advertising Santos Family Motors visible through the windshield, but Derek had never felt further from the safety of family influence. Alex Winters rode alone in the third car, clutching his ribs where he'd collided with the desk during his graceless tumble. The phone that had captured their downfall sat in an evidence bag on the seat beside him, its screen dark but its memory full of incriminating footage that would soon destroy everything they'd built. Alex had always prided himself on being the smartest of the trio, the one who planned their operations with careful attention to legal loopholes and plausible deniability. Now he realized that all his cleverness had done was provide law enforcement with a detailed record of their crimes. The Riverside Police Department was ill-equipped to handle 3 simultaneous felony arrests involving the sons of the town's most prominent families. Officer Rodriguez found herself fielding phone calls from lawyers, parents, and city council members before the boys had even been processed. The pressure was immediate and intense, but the video evidence made it impossible for anyone to claim this was a misunderstanding or youthful indiscretion gone wrong. Chief Detective Maria Santos, no relation to Derek despite the shared surname, had been investigating complaints about Brandon's crew for months without being able to make anything stick. The boys were too smart to leave physical evidence, too connected to face serious consequences, and too careful to cross lines that would generate felony charges. Today's incident changed everything. The video showed premeditation, coordination, and escalation to armed assault, all captured in high definition by one of the perpetrators themselves. Maya Chen sat in the victim services room, giving her statement to Detective Santos while a paramedic checked her for injuries she insisted she didn't have. The contrast between Maya's calm demeanor and the chaos her actions had unleashed was striking. She answered every question with precision, providing exact times, detailed descriptions, and a chronological account that painted a clear picture of escalating harassment culminating in destruction of property and assault with a weapon. "Miss Chen," Detective Santos said, reviewing her notes, "you mentioned that this wasn't the first incident. Can you walk me through the pattern of harassment you've experienced?" Maya nodded, pulling out a small notebook she'd been keeping since the problems began. "I started documenting everything 3 weeks ago when I found my art supplies had been tampered with. Someone had opened every tube of paint just enough to let air in, which would ruin them over time. 2 days later, several expensive brushes were soaked in turpentine overnight. Nothing stolen, nothing obviously broken, but systematic sabotage designed to frustrate and intimidate." Detective Santos made careful notes as Maya continued her account. The pattern was clear. Escalating harassment designed to terrorize without leaving obvious evidence, exactly the kind of sophisticated bullying campaign that had made Brandon's crew so dangerous. But today they'd finally overplayed their hand, moving from psychological warfare to physical destruction and assault. "The painting they destroyed," Maya continued, her voice remaining steady despite the obvious pain the topic caused, "was a memorial to my grandmother. I'd been working on it for 3 months. Staying after school most evenings. It wasn't just artwork to me, it was tazos lingus, healing, therapy, a way to process grief and honor someone who shaped my entire life." The detective looked up from her notes. "That adds emotional distress and destruction of memorial property to the charges." This case just got a lot more serious. While Maya provided her statement, the 3 boys were being processed through the system with a thoroughness that their family connections couldn't circumvent. Fingerprints, photographs, property inventories, and Miranda warnings delivered by officers who'd grown tired of watching privileged teenagers escape consequences for increasingly serious crimes. The video evidence made denial impossible, and the weapon elevated simple vandalism to assault charges that carried real prison time. Brandon's father arrived first, Richard Mitchell's construction trucks, creating a small traffic jam in the police station parking lot, as employees and subcontractors followed their boss to what they assumed would be another routine extraction of his son from minor legal troubles. Richard stormed through the front doors of the station with the confidence of someone accustomed to solving problems through intimidation and financial leverage. "Where's my son?" Richard demanded of the desk sergeant, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been told no by local officials. "I want him released immediately. This is obviously some kind of misunderstanding." Sergeant Mike O'Brien, a 20-year veteran who'd watched the Mitchell family's influence corrupt local justice for too long, looked up from his paperwork with the expression of someone delivering long overdue news. "Your son is being held on charges of breaking and entering, vandalism, assault with a weapon, and intimidation of a school employee. He's not going anywhere until he sees a judge." Richard's face flushed red as he leaned across the desk. "Do you know who I am? Do you know how much money I donate to the Fraternal Order of Police? I employ half this town, and I can just as easily unemploy them." "Sir," Sergeant O'Brien replied with carefully controlled politeness, "I'm going to need you to step back and lower your voice. Your son committed felonies that were captured on video. Money and connections won't change that." The mention of video evidence stopped Richard's bluster cold. "What video?" Detective Santos emerged from the interview room, drawn by the commotion in the lobby. She recognized Richard Mitchell immediately and had been expecting this confrontation. "Mr. Mitchell, your son and his friends filmed themselves destroying school property with a box cutter. They also filmed their subsequent assault on a teacher who tried to stop them. Would you like to see the footage?" Richard's confidence cracked like ice in spring. "I need to speak with my lawyer." "That's your right," Detective Santos agreed. "But I should warn you that this case is going to generate significant media attention. The video is extremely clear, and the victim is a decorated martial artist who showed remarkable restraint in defending herself against 3 much larger attackers. This isn't going to be the kind of problem that money can make disappear." As if summoned by her words, the first news van pulled into the parking lot, its satellite dish extending toward the sky like a metal flower blooming toward scandal. The story had leaked, probably through one of the many officials who'd received frantic phone calls from worried parents. By evening, the incident would be trending on social media. By tomorrow, it would be national news. Derek's parents arrived together, his mother Elena crying before she'd even entered the building, while his father Roberto tried to project the kind of calm authority that had built their business empire. They'd immigrated to America with nothing and sacrificed everything to build a life where their children would never face the poverty and discrimination they'd endured. Derek's arrest felt like a betrayal of every dream they'd harbored, every sacrifice they'd made. "Me Joe," Elena whispered when she finally saw her son through the reinforced glass of the interview room. "What have you done?" Derek couldn't meet his mother's eyes. For all his size and swagger, he looked like what he was, an 18-year-old boy who'd finally encountered consequences he couldn't muscle his way through. The confident athlete who'd terrorized smaller students for years had been reduced to this trembling figure who couldn't explain to his heartbroken parents why he'd thrown away everything they'd built for him. Roberto Santos spoke with Detective Santos in rapid-fire Spanish, switching to English only when he realized the conversation needed to be part of the official record. "My son, he has scholarship offers. Football, academics. This will destroy his future." "Mr. Santos," Detective Santos replied gently, "your son participated in the planned destruction of a memorial artwork and assault on a teacher. His future was destroyed the moment he made those choices. The video evidence is incontrovertible." Alex's parents presented yet another variation of privileged panic. Attorney David Winters arrived with his own legal team in tow, prepared to wage war against the charges using every procedural weapon in his considerable arsenal. His wife, Catherine, a prominent socialite whose charity work had made her the unofficial queen of Riverside society, followed behind wearing the kind of stunned expression reserved for those whose carefully constructed worlds suddenly collapse. "This is preposterous," David announced to anyone within hearing range. "My son is 18 years old with no criminal record and a 4.0 GPA. He's been accepted to Harvard. For Christ's sake. Some vindictive teacher can't destroy his life because she got her feelings hurt." Detective Santos had been waiting for this particular brand of entitled outrage. "Mr. Winters, your son filmed himself and his friends committing multiple felonies. He filmed them planning the attack, executing it, and assaulting a teacher who tried to stop them. If your son gets into Harvard with a felony conviction, it'll be because of his family's connections, not because he deserves to be there." David's legal training kicked in as he realized the gravity of the situation. "I want to see this alleged video evidence immediately." "Of course," Detective Santos replied, leading him to a computer terminal. "Your son was kind enough to capture everything in high definition." The video played on the small screen, and David Winters watched his son's future evaporate frame by frame. There was Brandon with the box cutter, describing his intentions to the camera. There was Derek holding the painting steady for maximum damage. There was Alex himself, filming with obvious glee, as months of artistic work were systematically destroyed. And there was Chen, asking them to stop, trying to reason with them, being ignored and dismissed right up until the moment she demonstrated that sometimes reason must be backed by force. "Jesus Christ," David whispered as the video ended. "Alex, what the hell were you thinking?" Through the interview room glass, Alex met his father's eyes for the first time since his arrest. "I was thinking we were untouchable," he said quietly. "I was thinking we could do anything to anyone and never face consequences. I was wrong." The truth of that statement was becoming clear to everyone involved. The comfortable world where family connections and financial influence could paper over criminal behavior was crumbling, replaced by a system that seemed determined to apply actual justice, regardless of social status. The video evidence made defense impossible, and the media attention made quiet resolution unthinkable. News crews multiplied outside the police station like bacteria in a petri dish. Local reporters were joined by regional affiliates, then national correspondents drawn by the irresistible story of privileged teenagers destroyed by their own arrogance and a tiny teacher who refused to be victimized. The footage of Maya's swift, precise defensive actions played on loop across social media platforms, generating millions of views and thousands of comments celebrating her courage. Inside Riverside High, word of the arrests spread through the halls with the speed of wildfire in drought conditions. Students who'd spent years living in fear of Brandon's crew emerged from their shells like flowers after rain. Teachers who'd grown accustomed to turning blind eyes to harassment began speaking openly about incidents they'd witnessed but never reported. The carefully maintained culture of intimidation that had protected the school's worst actors was dissolving in real time. Principal Morrison found himself fielding calls from district administrators, school board members, and media outlets demanding explanations for how the situation had been allowed to escalate. The reports Maya had filed about escalating harassment sat in his desk drawer like ticking time bombs, each one a documented failure of leadership that could end his career. He'd ignored her complaints because addressing them would have meant confronting the families who controlled the school's funding and his own job security. "Sir," his secretary announced through the intercom, "the superintendent is here to see you." Dr. Patricia Williams entered Morrison's office with the expression of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. She'd driven from the district headquarters as soon as the news broke, and her face reflected both fury and resignation. Morrison's failure to address the harassment reports had created a liability nightmare that would cost the district millions in lawsuits and decades in reputation damage. "Paul," Dr. Williams said, using Morrison's first name in a way that immediately established the conversation's serious tone, "I need you to explain to me how 3 students were able to break into a teacher's classroom with weapons, destroy her personal property, and assault her while she attempted to seek help from the administration." Morrison shuffled through the papers on his desk, looking for excuses that weren't there. The situation was complicated. The families involved have significant influence in the community. "I was trying to handle things diplomatically." "Diplomatically," Dr. Williams repeated, her voice rising. "You handled criminal harassment diplomatically? You allowed a decorated educator to be terrorized because you were afraid of upsetting influential parents?" The questions were rhetorical, and both of them knew it. Morrison's career was over, destroyed by his decision to prioritize political considerations over student and staff safety. The district would need a scapegoat to deflect liability, and he'd volunteered for the role through his own inaction. "I want your resignation on my desk by 5 o'clock, Dr. Williams continued. "And I want a complete accounting of every complaint filed by Ms. Chen. every incident involving those 3 students, and every decision you made to ignore evidence of escalating criminal behavior. While administrators scrambled to manage the fallout, Maya Chen sat in her empty classroom, surveying the damage that would take weeks to fully address. The police had taken photos of everything for evidence, leaving chalk outlines where furniture had been displaced and evidence tags marking the locations of key events. Her grandmother's memorial painting lay in tatters on the floor, but somehow the destruction felt less devastating than it had hours earlier. She'd spent 3 years believing that peace was always preferable to conflict, that turning the other cheek was the highest form of moral behavior, that violence was never an appropriate response to provocation. Today had shattered those beliefs, replacing them with a more complex understanding of when strength was necessary to protect what mattered most. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues, friends, and family members who'd seen the news reports. Text after text expressed support, admiration, and disbelief that quiet Maya Chen had taken down 3 larger opponents without breaking a sweat. But the message that mattered most came from her mother, a woman who'd spent her own life navigating the challenges of being small and female in a world that often mistook gentleness for weakness. "I'm proud of you," the text read. "Grandma would be proud too. You honored her memory by protecting it." Maya smiled through tears. She hadn't realized she was crying. Her grandmother had survived poverty, discrimination, and loss through quiet strength and unshakable dignity. She'd taught Maya that true power came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to know when hurting others was necessary to protect what you loved. The sound of footsteps in the hallway drew Maya's attention to her doorway, where a small crowd of students had gathered. These weren't the popular kids or the athletes who typically commanded attention. These were the quiet ones, the different ones. The targets who'd learned to make themselves invisible to avoid becoming victims. But today they stood in her doorway with expressions of gratitude and amazement. "Miss Chen," said Jennifer Walsh, a sophomore who'd been one of Derek's favorite victims until today, "we wanted to thank you. Not just for today, but for showing us that we don't have to accept being treated badly." "You were so brave," added Marcus Kim, a junior who'd endured months of racial harassment from Alex. "I never thought anyone would stand up to them. I never thought they could be stopped." One by one, the students shared their stories of harassment, intimidation, and fear. They talked about projects destroyed, confidence shattered, and dreams deferred because they'd learned to keep their heads down and avoid attention. Maya listened to each story, recognizing in their experiences the systematic campaign of terror that had made Brandon's crew so effective. "You don't need me to protect you," Maya told them when they'd finished. "You have more strength than you realize. Today just showed you that bullies aren't invincible. They're just people who've never faced consequences for their actions." "But we're not martial artists," Jennifer protested. "We can't do what you did." Maya smiled, the expression carrying the wisdom earned through years of combat training and 3 hours of life-changing confrontation. Physical strength is just one kind of power. You have others. You have voices, you have solidarity, you have the courage to document injustice and demand accountability. Today you saw what happens when someone finally says enough and backs it up. Tomorrow you can be the one saying it. The students left with a different energy than they'd carried into her classroom. For the first time in years, they walked with their heads up, their shoulders back, their voices carrying the confidence of people who'd witnessed the fall of tyrants. The culture of fear that had dominated Riverside High for so long was beginning to crack, and light was seeping through the fissures. As evening approached, Maya finally allowed herself to leave the school building. The parking lot was nearly empty except for news vans and the cars of administrators working late to manage the crisis. She walked to her small Honda Civic with the measured pace of someone whose world had fundamentally shifted, but who wasn't quite ready to process the magnitude of that change. Her phone rang as she reached her car. The caller ID showed her sister's number, and Maya answered with the weary resignation of someone who'd been fielding concerned calls all afternoon. "Maya!" Her sister Angela's voice exploded through the speaker. "I just saw the news. Are you okay? Are you hurt? Did you really take down 3 football players?" "I'm fine, Angie," Maya replied, settling into her driver's seat. "And they weren't football players. 2 were, 1 wasn't. Details matter." "Details matter?" Angela laughed, with a slightly hysterical edge of someone processing shocking news. "My little sister just went viral for kicking ass like some kind of action movie hero, and she's worried about accuracy in sports reporting. Maya started her car and began the familiar drive home, passing through downtown Riverside with its collection of small businesses, family restaurants, and civic buildings that had formed the backdrop of her quiet life for 3 years. Everything looked the same, but she felt fundamentally different, as if she'd shed a skin she'd been wearing without realizing it. "I didn't want this kind of attention," Maya said, watching news vans in her rearview mirror. "I just wanted to teach art and live peacefully. I wanted to leave the fighting behind." "Sometimes the fighting follows you," Angela replied, her voice growing serious. "Sometimes you can't avoid it. You can only choose whether to fight back or let yourself be destroyed." "Sounds like you made the right choice." Maya thought about her grandmother's memorial painting. About 3 months of careful work destroyed in minutes by people who valued cruelty over creation. She thought about the years of harassment reports ignored by administrators more concerned with political convenience than student safety. She thought about the culture of fear that had allowed predators to operate with impunity until someone finally stood up and said, "No more." "Yeah," she said quietly. "I think I did." The next morning would bring new challenges: media interviews, legal proceedings, administrative reviews, and the complex process of rebuilding a school culture around principles of accountability rather than influence. But tonight, Maya Chen drove home through quiet streets, past peaceful neighborhoods, toward a rest earned through the kind of courage that changes everything. The age of consequence had arrived at Riverside High, and it had arrived with the precision of a martial artist who'd remembered that sometimes the most important fights can't be avoided, only won or lost. Maya had chosen to win, and in doing so she'd shown an entire community that strength without compassion was just bullying, but compassion without strength was just victimhood. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow would be better. Tonight, that was enough. The courthouse steps buzzed with activity as reporters positioned themselves for the best angles, while protesters gathered on opposite sides of the plaza. On one side, students from Riverside High held signs reading "Ania quote Ania quote Ains quote Ania quote Ania quote Ania quote Ania quote" and "End bullying now," their young voices chanting slogans that echoed off the granite facade. On the other side, a smaller but more vocal group of parents and community members demanded due process and protect our children. Their anger focused on what they saw as an overreaction to typical teenage behavior. Judge Patricia Hernandez had seen enough cases involving privileged young defendants to recognize the patterns, but the evidence in this case was unlike anything that had crossed her bench. The video footage was unambiguous, the charges were serious, and the media attention was intense enough to make political considerations irrelevant. She'd spent the previous evening reviewing every frame of Alex Winter's inadvertent confession, studying the calculated cruelty that preceded Maya Chen's defensive response. Brandon Mitchell entered the courtroom wearing the kind of expensive suit that his father believed could substitute for character, but his usual swagger had been replaced by the nervous energy of someone finally facing consequences he couldn't buy his way out of. His legal team consisted of 3 attorneys who specialized in making wealthy people's problems disappear, but even they seemed subdued by the weight of evidence against their client. Derek Santos walked beside his parents, his mother Elena still crying intermittently, while his father Roberto maintained the stoic expression of someone watching a dream die in real time. The scholarship offers that had represented their family's pathway to generational success had evaporated within hours of the arrest, replaced by legal bills that threatened to destroy everything they'd built. Derek's size, which had once made him intimidating, now made him look ridiculous in the juvenile defendant's chair, a large child who'd played with fire until it burned down his future. Alex Winters sat with a hunched posture of someone carrying the weight of ultimate responsibility. His phone had captured not just the crime, but the premeditation, the planning, the gleeful anticipation of causing pain. Every legal expert who'd reviewed the footage agreed that Alex's decision to film had transformed a vandalism case into something much more serious, providing prosecutors with evidence that would have been impossible to obtain otherwise. Maya Chen occupied the witness section with a composure that impressed everyone present. She wore a simple black dress that conveyed respect for the proceedings without suggesting victimhood, and her bearing reflected the calm confidence of someone who'd found peace with her actions. The past month had been a whirlwind of interviews, depositions, and media attention that she'd navigated, with the same precision she'd once brought to martial arts competitions. District Attorney Sarah Mitchell, no relation to Brandon despite the shared surname, had built her career on cases that powerful families preferred to see dismissed or plea-bargained into irrelevance. This case represented something different: clear evidence, sympathetic victim, and enough public attention to make political interference impossible. She'd prepared for this moment like a surgeon approaching a critical operation, knowing that success would send a message about justice that extended far beyond Riverside's city limits. "Your Honor," D.A. Mitchell began, rising to address the court, "the state will prove that these three defendants engaged in a premeditated campaign of harassment that culminated in breaking and entering, destruction of property, and assault with a weapon. We will show that their actions were not spontaneous teenage mischief, but calculated cruelty designed to terrorize an educator who had committed no offense other than excelling at her profession." Defense attorney Marcus Webb, representing Brandon Mitchell, stood to offer his counterargument. Webb had spent 30 years making rich people's problems disappear, but this case challenged even his considerable skills. "Your Honor, while my client's actions were certainly inappropriate, the prosecution's characterization transforms a school disciplinary matter into something far more sinister. These are teenagers who made poor choices, not hardened criminals deserving of felony convictions." Judge Hernandez had heard variations of this argument countless times, usually from lawyers representing clients whose families could afford the kind of legal representation that came with implied promises of leniency. "Mr. Webb, your client brought a weapon to school, used it to destroy another person's property, and threatened an educator who tried to intervene. The defendant's age doesn't diminish the seriousness of those actions." The prosecution's case unfolded with the methodical precision of someone presenting overwhelming evidence. Security footage showed the defendants covering surveillance cameras before entering Maya's classroom. Cell phone records proved they'd coordinated their activities through text messages that revealed their intent to teach the art teacher a lesson. Most damaging of all was Alex's own video, which captured not just the crime but their evident pleasure in committing it. D.A. Mitchell played the footage for the court, and even the defense attorneys seemed to wince as Brandon's voice echoed through the courtroom speakers. This is what happens when people think they're better than everyone else. When they think their little hobby makes them special. The casual cruelty in his tone made several jurors shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," D.A. Mitchell continued, "you've just heard a confession. The defendant explicitly states his motivation: to punish Miss Chen for the crime of being talented and receiving recognition for her work. This wasn't a prank or a moment of poor judgment. This was a calculated attack on excellence itself." Maya's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. She described the months of escalating harassment with clinical precision, detailing each incident of sabotage and intimidation that had preceded the final confrontation. Her voice remained steady as she explained the significance of the memorial painting, the grief it represented, and the healing it had provided during the most difficult period of her life. "The painting wasn't just artwork," Maya explained to the silent courtroom. "It was my way of processing my grandmother's death, of honoring her memory, of transforming grief into something beautiful. When they destroyed it, they weren't just damaging property. They were attacking the most personal expression of love and loss I'd ever created." Under cross-examination, defense attorney Webb attempted to portray Maya as an aggressor who'd used excessive force against teenagers. "Miss Chen, you have extensive martial arts training, correct? 15 years of competition experience?" "That's correct," Maya replied calmly. "And on the day in question, you struck 3 students, causing them to fall and sustain injuries?" Maya's response was measured and precise. "I defended myself against 3 individuals who had just committed assault with a weapon. I used minimal force to neutralize the threat and prevent further violence. None of them required medical attention." Webb pressed harder, sensing that his only chance lay in making Maya appear as the aggressor. "But you could have simply left the room and called for help, couldn't you? Instead, you chose to engage in physical confrontation." "Mr. Webb," Maya replied, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had intimidated 3 bullies, "they had already demonstrated their willingness to use weapons and their intent to cause maximum psychological damage. Leaving the room would have given them time to complete their destruction. and potentially hurt other students who might have intervened. I stopped the threat using the minimum force necessary. The defense's case relied heavily on character witnesses who testified to the defendant's previous good behavior and community involvement. Brandon's youth pastor spoke about his volunteer work at church events, though he admitted under cross-examination that he'd never observed Brandon interacting with students from different social backgrounds. Derek's football coach praised his work ethic and leadership, but acknowledged that he'd received complaints about Derek's treatment of younger players that he'd attributed to "normal hazing." Alex's case presented the greatest challenge for his defense team because his own footage had captured him orchestrating the entire incident. His attorney, Jennifer Walsh, focused on his academic achievements and college prospects, arguing that a felony conviction would destroy a brilliant young mind's potential. Alex Winters has been accepted to Harvard University, she told the jury. He scored in the 99th percentile on standardized tests and maintained a perfect GPA throughout high school. One moment of poor judgment shouldn't destroy everything he's worked to achieve. D.A. Mitchell's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. Mr. Winters, you filmed your friends destroying Miss Chen's memorial painting, correct? Yes, Alex admitted, his voice barely audible. And you can be heard laughing on that recording as they destroyed months of her work? Yes. You also filmed yourself and your co-defendants planning this attack, describing it as teaching her a lesson, correct? Alex's shoulders sagged. Yes. This wasn't a moment of poor judgment, was it, Mr. Winters? This was a premeditated assault that you documented because you wanted to humiliate Miss Chen and share that humiliation with others. The courtroom fell silent as Alex struggled to find words that might minimize his culpability. We didn't think about the consequences. You didn't think about the consequences to Miss Chen when you destroyed her memorial to her deceased grandmother? No. You didn't think about the consequences to the other students who were living in fear of your group's retaliation? No. You thought only about your own entertainment, your own sense of power, your own amusement at causing pain to someone you considered beneath you. Alex's yes was whispered, but the courtroom's acoustics carried it to every corner of the room. The character assassination continued as D.A. Mitchell presented evidence of the defendant's previous behavior that hadn't risen to the level of criminal charges, but established a pattern of escalating cruelty. Teachers testified about projects mysteriously destroyed before due dates, students spoke about harassment campaigns that had driven victims to transfer schools, and administrators admitted to receiving complaints they'd failed to properly investigate. Jennifer Walsh, a sophomore who'd been terrorized by Derek Santos for months, took the stand with visible nervousness but growing confidence as she described the culture of fear that had dominated Riverside High. I changed my schedule to avoid classes where Derek might be, she testified. I ate lunch in the library because the cafeteria wasn't safe. I stopped participating in activities I loved because I was afraid of drawing attention to myself. Did you report these incidents to school administrators? D.A. Mitchell asked. Multiple times, Jennifer replied. But nothing ever happened. They'd say they'd look into it, but Derek never faced any consequences. Eventually, I stopped reporting because it only made the harassment worse. The pattern was repeated by witness after witness. Systematic harassment, ignored by administrators who prioritized avoiding confrontation with influential families over protecting vulnerable students. The institutional failure that had enabled Brandon's crew became as much a subject of the trial as their individual crimes. Dr. Patricia Williams, the superintendent who'd fired Principal Morrison, testified about the administrative failures that had allowed the situation to escalate. In reviewing Mr. Morrison's files, we found dozens of incident reports that were never properly investigated. Students and teachers had been complaining about these defendants for months, but those complaints were consistently minimized or ignored. Why do you believe these reports were ignored? D.A. Mitchell asked. Dr. Williams' answer was carefully measured but devastating. It appears that administrative decisions were influenced by considerations of family wealth and political connections rather than student safety. The defendants' families wielded significant influence in the community, and that influence was used to shield their children from consequences. The defense attorneys fought valiantly to minimize their clients' culpability, but the evidence was overwhelming and the video footage was devastating. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological impact of systematic harassment, the significance of destroying memorial artwork, and the escalation pattern that often leads from bullying to more serious criminal behavior. Dr. Rebecca Chen, a psychologist who specialized in school violence prevention, provided context that made the defendant's actions even more damning. This type of systematic harassment represents a form of psychological torture. The victims live in constant fear, never knowing when they'll be targeted next. The destruction of Miss Chen's memorial painting was particularly cruel because it attacked not just her professional work, but her personal grief and healing process. In your professional opinion, D.A. Mitchell asked, how should we understand the defendant's decision to film their attack? Filming suggests several concerning psychological factors. Drive, Chen replied. First, it indicates premeditation and planning. Second, it shows a desire to extend the victim's humiliation beyond the immediate incident. Third, it demonstrates a complete lack of empathy or concern for the psychological damage they were inflicting. This wasn't impulsive teenage behavior. It was calculated cruelty. The trial's turning point came when Maya was recalled to the stand for a redirect examination. D.A. Mitchell asked her to explain her decision to remain at Riverside High despite the harassment she'd endured. Teaching isn't just my profession, Maya said, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd found their calling. It's my purpose. I'd spent years learning to fight, to hurt people when necessary, to solve problems through violence. But teaching showed me a different kind of strength. It showed me that creation is more powerful than destruction, that building someone up is harder but more important than tearing them down. Why didn't you fight back against the harassment earlier? D.A. Mitchell asked. Maya considered the question carefully. Because I believed that responding to violence with violence would make me part of the problem. I thought that if I just endured it, if I kept creating and teaching and showing them a better way, they'd eventually stop. I was wrong. Some people only understand strength, and kindness without the ability to defend itself is just an invitation for abuse. Do you regret your actions in the classroom that day? I regret that it was necessary, Maya replied. I regret that 3 young men chose destruction over creation, cruelty over kindness, harassment over respect. But I don't regret defending myself and protecting what I love. If I hadn't acted, they would have continued hurting people, and eventually someone else would have gotten seriously injured. The defense's closing arguments focused on the defendant's youth, their potential for rehabilitation, and the lasting consequences of felony convictions. Each attorney painted their client as a misguided teenager who'd made poor choices but deserved a second chance to redeem themselves. Brandon Mitchell is 18 years old, his attorney argued. He's never been in serious trouble before, he has college prospects, and he comes from a family that's contributed significantly to this community. Yes, he made mistakes, but those mistakes shouldn't define the rest of his life. Similar arguments were made for Derek and Alex, with their attorneys emphasizing their academic achievements, athletic accomplishments, and potential contributions to society. The underlying message was clear. These boys were too valuable to society to be destroyed by the consequences of their actions. D.A. Mitchell's closing argument was a masterpiece of righteous indignation and legal precision. She reviewed the evidence methodically, highlighting the premeditation, the systematic nature of the harassment, and the complete lack of remorse shown by the defendants. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she concluded, this case isn't just about 3 teenagers who made poor choices. It's about a culture that taught them they were above consequences, that their wealth and status made them untouchable, that they could hurt others without ever being held accountable. Today, you have the opportunity to change that culture. You can send a message that in our community, justice isn't for sale, that privilege doesn't protect predators, and that actions have consequences regardless of who your parents are. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges for all 3 defendants. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers from Maya's supporters and sobs from the defendants' families. Judge Hernandez called for order, but the emotional release was too powerful to contain immediately. Brandon Mitchell's face went white as the verdict was read. The confident young man who'd swaggered through high school hallways had been replaced by someone who finally understood that his actions had consequences he couldn't escape. His parents sat in stunned silence, their world of influence and immunity crashing down around them. Derek Santos broke down completely, his massive frame shaking with sobs as he realized that his football career, his scholarship opportunities, and his family's dreams had all been destroyed by a few minutes of casual cruelty. His mother Elena held him as he cried, her own tears, a mixture of love, disappointment, and grief for the future that would never be. Alex Winters stared at the floor, his brilliant mind finally grasping the magnitude of what his decision to film had cost him. Harvard would rescind their offer within hours of the verdict. His legal career prospects were gone. His reputation was destroyed. All because he'd thought it would be entertaining to document someone else's pain. Judge Hernandez scheduled sentencing for the following month, giving probation officers time to prepare impact statements and allowing the defense teams to argue for leniency. But the guilty verdicts had already sent the message that mattered most. In Riverside, privilege would no longer protect predators. Outside the courthouse, Maya found herself surrounded by reporters demanding statements and students expressing gratitude. She answered questions with the same measured thoughtfulness she'd shown throughout the trial, refusing to gloat over the verdicts while acknowledging their importance. This was never about revenge, she told the assembled media. It was about accountability. These young men need to understand that their actions hurt real people, that cruelty has consequences, and that they can choose to be better than they were. I hope they use this experience to become the kind of men their victims can forgive. The ripple effects of the trial extended far beyond the courthouse steps. Riverside High underwent a complete cultural transformation under new leadership that prioritized student safety over political convenience. Anti-bullying programs were implemented with real teeth, creating reporting mechanisms that couldn't be ignored and consequences that couldn't be bought off. Maya returned to her classroom to find it transformed by community support. Local businesses had donated new art supplies. Parents had funded equipment upgrades, and students had created a memorial wall where victims of bullying could share their stories anonymously. The culture of fear that had dominated the school for years was being replaced by something stronger, a community that protected its most vulnerable members. But perhaps the most significant change was in Maya herself. The gentle teacher who'd spent 3 years avoiding confrontation had been replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the most important battles can't be avoided, only won or lost. She learned that strength without compassion was just bullying, but compassion without strength was just an invitation for abuse. The memorial painting to her grandmother would never be recreated exactly as it had been, but Maya began work on something new, a piece that captured not just grief and love, but also the courage to stand up and fight for what matters most. It would be different from the original, stronger perhaps, tempered by fire and forged in the crucible of consequence. The age of accountability had arrived at Riverside High, and it had arrived with the precision of a martial artist who'd remembered that sometimes the most important fights are the ones you don't want to have but can't afford to lose. 2 years had passed since the courtroom doors closed on Brandon Mitchell, Derek Santos, and Alex Winters, but the echoes of their choices still reverberated through Riverside like ripples in a pond. The community had transformed in ways both subtle and profound, shaped by the understanding that actions carried weight, regardless of family name or bank account balance. Maya Chen stood before her newest masterpiece, a canvas that told the story of resilience through abstract forms and bold colors. The piece would be unveiled at the upcoming Riverside Arts Festival, an event that had grown from a small school showcase into a regional celebration of creativity and courage. Students from across 3 counties submitted work, but more importantly, they came to learn from the teacher who had become synonymous with standing up for what mattered. The art program at Riverside High had expanded beyond recognition. What had once been a single classroom tucked away in the oldest wing now occupied an entire renovated building, complete with sculpture studios, digital labs, and exhibition spaces funded by grants that flowed freely to schools with reputations for protecting rather than tolerating abuse. Maya found herself directing a program that served as a model for arts education nationwide, but her proudest achievement remained simpler. No student in her building feared coming to school. Jennifer Walsh entered the studio carrying a portfolio that represented 3 years of artistic growth nurtured in an environment free from terror. The frightened sophomore who had once testified about living in fear had blossomed into a confident senior whose college applications included scholarship offers from prestigious art schools. Her latest series explored themes of transformation and empowerment, visual narratives that spoke to experiences shared by countless students who had found their voices in the aftermath of accountability. "Miss Chen," Jennifer said, approaching with the respectful familiarity of someone whose life had been fundamentally altered by her teacher's courage. "I wanted you to see this before I submit it to the regional competition." Maya studied the piece with the careful attention she gave to all her students' work, but Jennifer's latest creation demanded deeper consideration. The painting depicted a small figure standing against overwhelming darkness, but instead of being consumed, The figure radiated light that pushed back the shadows and revealed a landscape of possibility beyond. The technical skill was impressive, but the emotional truth was profound. "This is exceptional work," Maya said, meaning every word. "The composition creates tension while suggesting resolution, and your color choices convey both vulnerability and strength. But more than that, it tells a story that others need to hear." Jennifer beamed with the pride of someone whose artistic vision had been recognized and validated. "I wanted to capture what it felt like that day in the courtroom, when we realized that speaking truth could actually create change. Before that, I thought victims just had to endure. Now I know we can transform pain into power." The sentiment reflected a broader shift that had occurred throughout Riverside. Students who had once accepted harassment as inevitable now documented incidents, supported each other, and demanded accountability from adults who had previously turned blind eyes to suffering. The culture of silence that had protected predators had been replaced by networks of mutual protection that made targeting individuals nearly impossible. Marcus Kim approached with his own portfolio, his confident stride a stark contrast to the nervous shuffle he had once employed to avoid attention. The junior, who had endured months of racial harassment from Alex Winters, now served as president of the student council and captain of the debate team, positions that would have been unthinkable during the reign of terror that had dominated his earlier high school experience. "Miss Chen," Marcus said, "the memorial committee has finalized the design for the garden project. We wanted your approval before we present it to the administration." Maya reviewed the plans with growing amazement. The students had designed a reflection space that honored victims of bullying while celebrating the courage required to stand against injustice. The centerpiece was a sculpture created collaboratively by dozens of students, each contributing elements that represented their own experiences of fear, survival, and ultimately empowerment. The garden would be dedicated in the spring, timed to coincide with the anniversary of the trial that had changed everything. "This is beautiful," Maya said, studying the detailed drawings that showed pathways winding between plantings chosen for their symbolic significance and practical beauty. "Your grandmother would be proud, Marcus. She fought her own battles against prejudice and discrimination. Now you're honoring that legacy by creating something that will help others." The mention of Marcus's grandmother triggered memories of Maya's own loss, the grief that had inspired the memorial painting destroyed by 3 young men who had valued cruelty over creation. The original work could never be recovered, but Maya had discovered that some losses become foundations for something stronger. Her new pieces carried the pain of that destruction while celebrating the resilience that had emerged from ashes. Dr. Patricia Williams arrived for her monthly visit, a routine she had established to ensure that the transformation at Riverside High remained genuine rather than superficial. The superintendent had staked her career on the proposition that schools could change fundamentally when leadership prioritized safety over convenience, and Riverside had become her proof of concept. "Maya," Dr. Williams said, surveying the bustling art studios with satisfaction, "I've been reviewing the latest incident reports. Bullying complaints are down 92% from pre-trial levels. Academic performance is up across all demographics, and teacher satisfaction scores are at record highs. More importantly, student surveys show that 97% feel safe at school." Maya nodded, understanding that the numbers reflected something more significant than statistical improvement. "The students police themselves now. They've learned that protecting each other protects everyone. When someone tries to cross the line, they face immediate consequences from their peers rather than administrative indifference." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a visitor who commanded immediate attention throughout the building. Tyler Morrison, the former principal's son, had returned to Riverside as a social worker, specializing in restorative justice programs. His father's career had ended in disgrace, but Tyler had used that experience to dedicate his life to preventing the kind of institutional failures that had enabled systematic abuse. "Miss Chen," Tyler said, extending his hand with the respectful formality of someone seeking to earn rather than inherit credibility, "I wanted to discuss the mentorship program we're developing for at-risk students. We believe your approach to building confidence through creative expression could be transformative." Maya had initially been skeptical of Tyler's involvement, wondering whether guilt over his father's failures motivated his career choice. But months of observing his work had convinced her that his commitment was genuine, rooted in understanding that privileges carried responsibilities, and that healing required accountability. "What did you have in mind?" Maya asked, leading him to a quiet corner where they could discuss details without disturbing the students working throughout the studio. Tyler outlined a program that would pair students who had experienced harassment with mentors trained in both artistic techniques and trauma recovery. The goal was not just healing but empowerment, teaching victims that their experiences could become sources of strength rather than shame. Maya found herself impressed by the thoughtfulness of the approach and the recognition that recovery required both emotional support and practical skills. "We want to start with 10 participants," Tyler explained. "Students who have been identified as particularly vulnerable or who have experienced recent incidents." The program would run for 12 weeks, with each session combining art therapy with traditional counseling techniques. Maya considered the proposal carefully. The program would require significant time and emotional investment, but the potential impact on vulnerable students was enormous. More importantly, it represented the kind of systemic change that could prevent future victims, rather than simply responding to harm after it occurred. "I'm interested," Maya said, "but I have conditions. First, participation must be completely voluntary with the option to withdraw at any time. Second, we need to ensure that this doesn't become a way to identify and target vulnerable students. Third, the focus must be on empowerment, rather than victimization." Tyler nodded enthusiastically, clearly having anticipated these concerns. "Absolutely. We want to build strength, not perpetuate weakness. The goal is to give these students tools they can use throughout their lives, not just cope with current problems." Their conversation was interrupted by commotion in the hallway, the sound of excited voices discussing something that had captured widespread attention. Maya and Tyler exchanged curious glances before moving toward the source of the disturbance. They found a crowd of students gathered around Jennifer Walsh, who was holding her phone with trembling hands while tears streamed down her face. Maya's first instinct was concern that someone had been hurt or threatened, but Jennifer's expression suggested joy rather than fear. "Miss Chen," Jennifer said, her voice shaking with emotion, "I just got the call. The National Arts Foundation wants to feature my transformation series in their annual exhibition. They said my work represents the kind of courage and resilience they want to celebrate." The announcement triggered celebration throughout the building as word spread that one of their own had achieved national recognition. But Maya understood that the real victory was simpler and more profound. A student who had once lived in fear was now creating art that inspired others to find their own courage. As the excitement died down and students returned to their projects, Maya found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years earlier, she had been a teacher struggling to maintain peace through patience and hoping that kindness would eventually overcome cruelty. The destruction of her grandmother's memorial had shattered those illusions, forcing her to acknowledge that some battles could not be avoided, only won or lost. The legal consequences for Brandon, Derek, and Alex had been significant but fair. Brandon had served 18 months in juvenile detention, followed by 2 years of supervised probation and community service focused on victim advocacy. Derek had received a similar sentence but had used his time to develop empathy through work with disabled veterans, learning to channel his size and strength toward protection rather than intimidation. Alex had faced additional penalties for his role in filming and planning the attack, but had used his intellectual gifts to research and develop anti-bullying programs that were now being implemented in schools across the state. Maya had followed their progress through victim impact reports and parole hearings, maintaining the perspective that accountability was about creating better people, rather than simply punishing wrongdoing. Each of the young men had demonstrated genuine remorse and concrete steps toward making amends, but more importantly, they had become advocates for the kind of cultural change that could prevent others from following their destructive path. The transformation extended beyond individual redemption to encompass systemic change throughout Riverside. The school board had implemented policies that prioritized student safety over political convenience, creating reporting mechanisms that could not be ignored and consequences that could not be purchased. Teachers felt empowered to address problems immediately, rather than hoping they would disappear, and students understood that their voices would be heard and respected. But perhaps the most significant change was in Maya herself. The gentle teacher who had once believed that turning the other cheek was always the right choice had evolved into someone who understood that sometimes the most important kindness was refusing to allow others to continue hurting people. She had learned that strength without compassion was mere bullying, but compassion without strength was just an invitation for abuse. As evening approached and the last students gathered their materials to leave, Maya stood alone in her studio surrounded by evidence of transformation. The walls displayed work created by students who had found their voices through art, their confidence through recognition, and their power through community. The space that had once been a refuge from harassment had become a launching pad for dreams that stretched far beyond Riverside's borders. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her sister Angela, who had become one of Maya's most enthusiastic supporters and frequent visitors to the school's art exhibitions. "Saw the news about Jennifer's recognition. You must be so proud. Grandma would be amazed to see what grew from the ashes of her memorial." Maya smiled at the message, understanding its deeper truth. Her grandmother's painting had been destroyed, but the principles it represented had proven indestructible. Love, creativity, resilience, and the courage to stand up for what mattered had survived the attack and grown stronger through adversity. The memorial had been transformed from a single work of art into an entire community committed to protecting rather than destroying beauty. The final visitor of the day was unexpected but welcome. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the psychologist who had testified about the psychological impact of systematic harassment, arrived carrying a proposal that could extend Riverside's transformation far beyond its own borders. "Maya, drive," Chen said, settling into a chair surrounded by student artwork. "I've been approached by the Department of Education to develop a national program based on what you've accomplished here. They want to create a curriculum that combines arts education with social-emotional learning and restorative justice principles." Maya listened as Dr. Chen outlined a vision that would train teachers across the country to recognize and respond to harassment while empowering students to create rather than destroy. The program would use artistic expression as both therapy and prevention, giving students tools to process trauma while building communities that protected vulnerable members. "They want you to lead the pilot program," Dr. Chen continued. "It would mean travel, training sessions, and probably more media attention than you're comfortable with. But it could also mean that what happened here becomes a model for schools everywhere." Maya considered the opportunity carefully. The national platform would amplify her message but also complicate her life in ways she had learned to avoid. However, the potential impact on students facing harassment in communities without Riverside's resources was too significant to ignore. "I'll do it," Maya said, surprising herself with the decisiveness of her response. "But I have the same conditions I gave Tyler for the mentorship program. The focus must be on empowerment rather than victimization. Participation must be voluntary, and the goal must be building strength rather than simply responding to weakness." Dr. Chen smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose instincts had been confirmed. "I told them you'd say exactly that. They're prepared to fund the program fully and give you complete autonomy over curriculum development. You'll be able to train teachers who can then transform their own communities." As Dr. Chen left with preliminary agreements to review, Maya found herself alone with the enormity of what lay ahead. The quiet art teacher who had once sought only peace and privacy was about to become the face of a national movement against harassment and for empowerment. The prospect was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. She walked to the window that overlooked the reflection garden the students were building, watching the setting sun illuminate pathways that would soon guide others toward healing and hope. The memorial to her grandmother had taken a form she could never have imagined, growing from personal loss into community transformation and now into national change. Maya Chen had learned that sometimes the most important battles choose you rather than the other way around. She had discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Most importantly, she had understood that the greatest strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to know when hurting others was necessary to protect what you loved. The age of accountability had arrived not just at Riverside High, but in communities across the nation, where educators were learning that kindness backed by strength was the only kind that could create lasting change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students to empower, and new communities to transform. Tonight, that was enough. Tomorrow would be better. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.